Before the lesson this evening, we'll read a verse from Deuteronomy chapter 18. Deuteronomy 18, verse 15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen.
I'd be a Backstreet Boy someday. And then I got this thing and I don't want it. Good evening. And I hope you all got your Sunday afternoon naps and everyone's rested. I appreciate the opportunity to be back tonight. And I'll try to do a better job gauging the clock and not keeping you super long. But none of you complained, so who knows? Our job this evening is to talk about the prince's humility. And we're going to do that by doing what we did this morning. We're going to start with Moses, and then we're going to proceed on and consider Jesus in contrast to Moses. And make sure we've got our slides going. There we go. Thank you. This morning we spent time trying to set the historical, geographical context, the political context for the birth of Moses, and we spent time looking at Exodus chapter 1 and about the first half of Exodus chapter 2. And what we're going to do this evening is pick up the thread of Moses' life in chapter 2, starting in about verse 11, and then get through the rest of that chapter. And we mentioned that the life of Moses breaks down into 3 sets of 40 years, and there's just so much about the first 80 that we don't know. I mean, in Exodus 2, you've got the birth of Moses, and by the time you get to the end of that chapter, 40 years is up and he's running into Midian. There's just so much about his life we don't know. We have some New Testament insight into this incident. We have some insight from Hebrews 11. We have some insight from Acts chapter 7, Stephen's sermon. And so we're going to look at those texts, but there's just a whole lot we kind of have to wonder and leave unknown, right? And so let's go ahead and start with that this evening. Let's get back to chapter 2, and let's pick up with verse 11. So we made mention as we concluded the section of his birth that he was weaned by his mother, given over to Pharaoh's daughter, raised in Pharaoh's court, and he's named a significant name. He's named Moses because she drew him out of the water. And Moses' deliverance from death foreshadows the Exodus. It foreshadows what God would do for the Israelites when he delivers them through the Red Sea. And so that's going on. We didn't mention it this morning, but I thought I'd mention it here. And so Moses grows up in a royal household with all the privileges that entails. And you just kind of have to wonder, what kind of life did he anticipate having? And what kind of plans did Pharaoh have in store for him? You know from chapter 1 that Pharaoh was afraid. The text says he was in dread of the Israelites, and the possibility that other invading people could come in and these people would revolt or disappear or whatever. And then all of a sudden he has this really unique opportunity. His daughter has adopted a Hebrew child. And there's a part of me that wonders if Pharaoh was like, hey, this could be a politically really good thing, where I raise this Hebrew child who has affection for me, who takes on some of the trappings of Egyptianhood, appreciates all of that, and he's kind of a bridge between me and the Hebrews. And so the Hebrews have an appreciation for me, and I wonder if Pharaoh had that in the back of his head for Moses. Like, I'd be shocked if he didn't. Whatever his plans were, in verse 11 it starts with one day. One day something happened. One day when Moses had grown up, he's 40. He wasn't grown up until he's 40. Kids, think about that. Not dating till you're 40. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And we mentioned the inductive study method through the text. That word is an important word in the book of Exodus, the idea of burdens. He looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And we made the point this morning, Moses, because of the providential nature of his life, grew up knowing who he was. He knew he was a Hebrew. And so he knows that he is at an advantage. He knows the rest of his people are at a severe disadvantage. He knows they're not getting a fair shake. And one day he looks down and he sees an Egyptian hurting one of his people. And he identifies with, that's my guy. We belong with each other. And he feels something for him. I seriously doubt that that's the first time he ever saw an Israelite getting hurt. But something happened on that day where he's like, this is the moment. And so verse 12, he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. That's code for he killed him. And buried him in order to hide him so that no one would know what happened. Verse 13, when he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? And the man answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? And then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. And when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. And you keep reading. The man who is going to deliver his family from Egyptian bondage ends up delivering a bunch of shepherds' daughters. Like that, there's this irony at the end of the chapter. Like that's how far he has fallen. He thought he was going to lead a nation out, and he delivers a bunch of girls. But good for him, marries one super appreciative, right? And what he ends up doing is he ends up taking on the role of a shepherd. And I want you to think about that for a second. You've got a guy that was in training to be highly influential in the Egyptian court, and he's taking care of smelly, dumb animals. And there's this fascinating thing that kids need to think about, high school kids, college kids. My brother Craig did this, and I'm going to beg him for his slide. He was teaching a class for an institute in Indianapolis, and he was asked to speak on his career path. Could you talk to us about how you wound up doing what you're doing right now? Which is a fascinating thing to ask somebody in their 30s and 40s. He's like, sure. And so he was talking to me about it as he developed it, right? And you have to explain where you thought you were going, not just how you got there. You know, so he's like, graduate high school and all the dreams in the world. And I went to college. I picked an art institute because I thought an art institute was going to help me make movies, and I was going to be a culture shaper for Christ and blah, 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 blah. So I go to art school, and I get a diploma from the art school in film. And then I start getting these horrible job offers to make gross stuff. And that's what he got. And he's like, well, I could start making big money right now, but I'd be making gross stuff. I can't do that. So I'm going to keep working at Starbucks for what feels like the rest of my life. And then realize Starbucks isn't going to pay the bills, and I want to get married, and Starbucks doesn't cut it. So I'm going to take on 2 jobs, then I'm going to take on 3 jobs, and then I'm going to do freelance stuff, and then I'm going to work here. And his job map was a hot spaghetti of a mess, which was fantastic. And now here I am in my 30s, and I work for a nonprofit where we give our videos away for free. Best business model ever. Right? And I have to freelance on the side to make that work. You think about Moses. What was Moses' career path? You stay here and you keep your nose clean and you make Pharaoh happy and you make your mom happy, and eventually you're going to have some really good, you're going to do great. And you've gone to all the right schools and you've gotten the training, and you've been around the priest and you wear nice clothes, and all that is great. And then at the end of the chapter, he's taking care of smelly, dumb animals in a backwoods country compared to Egypt. And the text in Exodus chapter 2 kind of makes you think that that was forced on him. But that's not what Acts 7 and Hebrews 11 say. So really quick, let's jump over to Acts chapter 7. And before we read that, there are some smelly sheep. That's what they look like. If you haven't been around sheep recently, they're gross. Stuff gets in their wool. Babies are cute. Adults are gross. Okay? Sorry to ruin your bubble, burst your bubble there. What you're looking at is a similar map to what we looked at this morning, but if you take that line straight across the two tips of the Red Sea, that's actually a caravan route, a well-known caravan route. And it's likely that Moses took that kind of route and then went further east and down, and that's about where Midian was. So somewhere along there. And there are a couple of traditional sites, there's no way to verify this, but there have been some traditional locations associated with the well that he helped out at for a long, long time. Now, whether it's actually the well or not, I'm not sure. But somewhere in that region, east of the eastern finger of the Red Sea, is where he likely wound up. And so he has fled and tried to get out of the jurisdiction of Pharaoh, and that's where he wound up. Before we get to reading Acts chapter 7, let's just make an observation about the prince's humility and where it started. It started when he saw his people's burdens. He looked and he saw someone that was hurting and decided, this is the day I need to do something about that. Okay, and we have that same kind of thing. Have you ever been going somewhere, you're in the middle of the day, and you realize, oh man, someone's hurting, and I should do something about that? I remember when I was about 19 years old, there was this cute girl that I was dating at the time. She's not Anna. Didn't marry her. She married someone else. I married someone else. We have great families, but we were dating at the time. And we were on our way to have dinner with someone from church, and it was winter, and we were driving on a state road in Indiana, and there was a grass median between the two sides of the highway, and as we went, we saw the car coming our direction on the other side of the highway lose control, flip upside down, and wind up upside down in a ditch because they hit ice. And in the moment, my girlfriend and I were like, what do we do about that? And we stopped. There was no one else. Like, there were no other cars coming, and we felt a moral responsibility, and like, we really didn't even talk about it. We kind of looked at each other, and I hit the brakes, and there we went. Right? I think that's what's going on with Moses. He didn't plan to do that day. It's just he happened to see someone in need and felt like he could do something about it. And so in Acts chapter 7, I think that idea is reinforced. Starting in about verse 20. There's so much to Stephen's sermon. We're just looking at the focus right now that he had on Moses. In about verse 20, Stephen said, "At this time Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight." That same idea that we talked about this morning. "And he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. And when he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and in his deeds." He did well at school. He did well at work. He was impressive. Verse 23. "When he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel." We've made the point. He knew all along who he was, but he finally got to the point in his adult life where he was like, I wonder if I can do something about this. Verse 24, "And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. And on the following day he appeared to them as they were quarreling and tried to reconcile them, saying, 'Men, you are brothers, why do you wrong each other?' But the man who was wronging his neighbor thrust him aside, saying, 'Who made you a ruler and a judge over us?'" It sounds like a conversation between siblings. "Who are you, man? You're my brother. Mom didn't tell you to say anything, and Dad, I don't have to listen to you." Right? But the man in verse 27 who was wronging his neighbor, thrust him aside, saying, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" And at this retort, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. We'll just stop right there, because that's about where we are in the story of Moses. He hit 40 years old, saw their oppression, and thought, I can do something about that. And maybe they'll recognize that I'm in a unique position to represent them or help them or make things better. And they didn't recognize it. Hebrews gets even more specific. Hebrews chapter 11, picking up in verse 24, we read this earlier. In verse 23, we read about Moses when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents. Verse 24 picks up Moses' response. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. That adds a whole nother level to this conversation. It wasn't just that he thought, hey, maybe I could help and make things better, and I'm just going to smooth things over. That's not what happened. What Moses was doing was choosing a side. He was choosing an identity in that moment. He wasn't trying to straddle the fence. He's saying, I am a Hebrew. Stop it. And if that means I don't get this stuff anymore, that's okay. And you think about the movies and the books that you may have been exposed to where they have a character that goes through that transformation. They're part of the cool kids. They're part of the in crowd. Everyone likes them, but they're kind of developing a friendship with the underdogs. And the underdogs are developing an affection for them. And there comes a point in the story where they have to choose. Do I keep being a superficial hypocrite? Or do I associate with the people that aren't appreciated, but they're genuine? And I may be mocked for that too. And the person, the protagonist, has to choose. That's Moses. He made a choice. I'm going to give all that up, even if it means I am seen as nothing but a Hebrew. And so several things that we'll say about Moses on this side of it. The first thing that the text emphasizes here in Hebrews is that he rejected his earthly, worldly advantage. I'm going to give up being called Pharaoh's grandson. I'm going to give that up. I think my wardrobe is about to take a serious hit. The food and the quality of the food, the ease of life that I have, I'm about to lose all that. He hasn't been oppressed. He hasn't been bearing burdens, but he's choosing to. He's about to choose that. He rejected all the worldly advantage that Stephen rattled off that he had back in Acts chapter 7. Going to give that all up. And what the Hebrew writer says in 11 is more than just that. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. There's something about the Egyptian life that Moses was living that was associated with sin. We could guess a lot of things about that. I mean, there was a lot of inappropriate behavior that went along with the idolatry that they practiced. There was immorality that had to do with being that high up. There were things that were available to him as a life of leisure that weren't available to other people. Whatever. That he had sin associated with that life. And he said, I don't want that anymore. I would rather be associated and hurting with God's people than continue to go along with the pleasure that is temporary. And I appreciate that. The pleasure is pleasurable. But he had an eternal perspective and was like, whatever the pleasure it is that I'm getting from this doesn't last. And there are things about that we need to be honest with ourselves and with our kids about. There are some things that are fun, and there are some things that feel good, and they are fun and they feel good. That doesn't mean that they last. I'm not going to tell you that they're not fun. I'm not going to tell you you won't get an adrenaline hit. I won't tell you dopamine won't kick in. It will, but it doesn't last. It doesn't last, and it's not worth it. Moses rejected temporary pleasure. Instead, what it says is he chose humiliation. He chose to be mistreated. What verse 26 says is he considered the reproach of Christ. The reproach of Christ. He would rather suffer reproach than to go along with that former manner of life. And the next point, we need to make some connection here, because if you're following, like if you read carefully, you're like, Jeremy skipped over something. It doesn't make sense. When you go back to Exodus chapter 2, he kills the Egyptian, he buries him. The next day there's the quarrel. One of the guys says, hey, are you going to kill me too? And then he's like, oh, the thing has become known. And it says he was afraid. But then when you read Acts 7, Stephen's like, he wasn't afraid of that. And then when you read Hebrews, it talks about, verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king. And you're like, so Jeremy, which one is it? Exodus 2 says he was afraid. Acts 7 and Hebrews 11 says he wasn't. Harmonize that, Bible scholar. I think there's a really simple answer. And I think you could compare it to 1 Peter chapter 3, when it's telling wives to be submissive, specifically in the scenario of a believing wife with an unbelieving husband. And he says, don't fear anything that is frightening. That doesn't make sense. I think this is what the text is saying. Was there a moment of fear? Yes. Did he live in terror? No. Did he feel the fear of possibly losing his life? Yes. Did he let that fear control him? No. I think Moses was really similar to the midwives of Exodus chapter 1, where they feared the Lord more than they feared the king. Does that mean that living under the threat of death wasn't fearful? No, of course it was a fearful thing. Of course you felt fear, and of course your heart started to pound and you thought it was up in your throat. But they didn't let that fear control them. Instead, they let their awe of God, their fear for the Lord, make the deciding factor in their choice. So as Moses evaluated everything, like, I either stay here and risk getting killed by Pharaoh, or I start a brand new life off with a bunch of guys in the middle of nowhere with, in desert with animals, and that's kind of scary. Which do I choose? Well, which one would please God the most? What does God want me to do? And he doesn't let fear control him. So he chooses humiliation, and he does not let fear control him. Let's go back to verse 26. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. He was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And this whole thing has to do with faith. It's a living example of faith. And what he ends up doing by faith is he endured. Goodness. Moses was 120 when he died. His segments are 40, 40, 40. I am barely on the backside of his first 40. And there are times I feel 120. He endured 80 more years than I've lived. That's endurance. Our perspective on life is so short. We need to develop a longer-term perspective on life and waiting on God to act in situations. And I'm not saying that we need to confuse patience with indifference. We're not supposed to be indifferent, but I think we need to be more patient a lot of times. Moses endured. He played the long game. But even though all of that is true, it doesn't change the fact that what led him to go to Midian was the rejection by his brothers. I struggle with trying to imagine what that felt like, because the truth is, I don't want to feel that. Nobody wants to feel rejected. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to risk rejection. Think about a guy and a girl, and they both kind of think each other is neat. Who makes the first move? Guess what? I'm the father of 2 daughters, and I've got 2 sons. Guess what my kids hear? The man makes the first move. I'm really old-fashioned about that. You want to know why? I've got several reasons, but I'll give you one because it ties into the point, which is why I'm saying it. The first one to make a move exposes themselves to the most risk. And there's this silly little thing, like we try to figure it out in little steps so we minimize the risk. I'll write a little note. Do you like me? Yes or no? Check this. Oh, kids don't do that anymore. They have phones. They text each other. Hey, so-and-so said that you might like me. You kind of want to sort of, huh? Like, that is the most ridiculous thing ever. But we do that kind of stuff. Did they like you on Facebook? Are they liking your posts? Was it a thumbs up or a heart? Was it a sad face? What was it? And we play all of these silly games to minimize the risk, but the truth is, the first one to finally put themselves out there exposes themselves to the most risk of rejection. And the other one saying, no, I like so-and-so instead. So if someone's interested in my daughters, they'll initiate because they're showing chivalry and exposing themselves to the greatest risk. And then they get to call me and we'll talk. And my daughter would be blushing if she was sitting here. But that's what we told our son to do too. We're like, you're going to man up and you're going to be the one. Like, you're going to take responsibility and you need to make the call. Because we don't want to be rejected. We don't like it. It hurts. But Moses, taking the stand that he did that day, exposed himself to risk, and it was realized. His people, the one that he was sticking his neck out for, his people rejected him. It wasn't Pharaoh, it was his own people. The ones that he was trying to benefit were the ones that were going to out him and get rid of him. So Moses was humbled all the way through. He saw his people's burdens. He rejected worldly advantage. He rejected temporary pleasure. He chose humiliation. He didn't let fear control him. He endured and ultimately was rejected. Now let's talk about Jesus. Okay? Let's talk about Christ. Jesus saw our burdens. He saw. I mean, God always sees. You can go back to Genesis chapter 6. God looked and saw that the thought of the heart of the intent of man was only evil continually. He saw. And when it says that God regretted making man, I think there's more in there than that. Because the word regret also means grieved. I think what that text in Hebrew is trying to communicate is they were breaking God's heart. They were falling so short of the glory that they had been created for. They were breaking God's heart with their lives because God saw. Right? Jesus saw. You think about Isaiah 59, when it talks about he carried our sorrows. He saw our sorrows. Before he could offer to carry them, he had to see them and acknowledge them and know they were there. You think about all the times where Jesus wept over people when he realized their condition or saw their condition. Or he talks about Jerusalem, how I wanted to gather you up like a hen gathers up her chicks, and you wouldn't. Like, he knew what they were suffering. Jesus saw our burdens. And then when you go to Philippians chapter 2, this is actually a text that we were looking at this last weekend. Thursday through Saturday, I was leading a marriage workshop, specifically going through the whole book of Philippians, and we flew. We had 8 lessons all the way through Philippians, but chapter 2 is great. And don't ask me to explain in every finite little detail that process, because I can't. But there are some things in it that are super important for us to understand. As Paul is writing to the church at Philippi, trying to get them to be less selfish and more selfless, he says in verse 3, do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others, having this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And one of the main points at the beginning of that is he rejected any advantage. We have other passages that emphasize the divinity of Jesus. You've got Hebrews chapter 1 that emphasizes the radiance of the glory that Jesus is of God. You want to know God? Get to know Jesus. But even though Jesus was divine, he didn't cling to that. And the idea there of clinging is white-knuckling something. Like, that's how tightly you're grasping it. Kind of like your parents do when they're teaching you how to drive. Because they're gripping the sides, and they will not let go. Jesus could have done that with his divinity. I'm hanging on to this, and I am not going down there. But he didn't. He let go of that. And what it continues to explain is that Jesus, who is divine, who is the form of God, didn't clasp that, but made himself nothing. Some of your English versions, depending on what you're reading, will say he emptied himself. I am so glad that the ESV says made himself nothing, because so much has been wasted over that phrase, he emptied himself. Let me just give you the Jeremy thinks so on that, because people have, what does it mean? What did he empty himself of? Himself. When someone is prideful, what do they say they're full of? Themselves. If someone is humble, what are they empty of? Themselves. Jesus emptied himself of himself. He wasn't going to build up any kind of pride and humility. That's what it's saying. He made himself nothing, taking on the form of a servant. A bondservant, a slave is what some of the English versions will say. Being born in the likeness of men and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross, a criminal's death. And there's so much irony in the New Testament when the apostles preach about the crucifixion of Jesus. In Acts, they'll say, you killed the author of life. How do you do that? Because he let you. He let you. Or in Acts chapter 2, when Peter is preaching on the day of Pentecost, and he talks about how he was killed, but death could not keep him there. He couldn't stay dead, but you still killed him. Like the irony of that. And the only reason that was possible is because he put on flesh. There was an example, and I can't remember the marriage book, but it was a marriage book talking about humility and trying to emphasize the point, and they tried to give a real-life example. And so I'll share this real-life example. It was portrayed as that. It does not involve anyone that you know. But there was a small Christian college. It was not in Tampa. Okay, you do not know this person. But there was a small Christian college decades ago where there were some boys that lived on campus in a dorm that got in trouble. They'd been causing all kinds of stuff throughout the whole semester, and the most recent thing that they did is they egged a building on campus. You don't read about that a whole lot anymore. I'm not trying to give you any ideas. I'm not giving you permission. This is not inspiration. Don't do it. Those college boys egged a building on campus, and so they got in trouble, and they had to go to the president's office. And so the president explained, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to write this up on your record. And by the way, Saturday, bright and early, you're going to be out there cleaning up the side of that wall. And on Saturday, they showed up. The president had gotten there 15 minutes early, wearing blue jeans, with a bucket, cleaning the wall. Did he have to do that? He did not. Did he normally wear blue jeans and carry around a bucket? No, he did not. But those boys never forgot what he did, and they did not egg another building, because that man humbled himself and lowered himself and did something that he didn't have to do in order to help them with a mess that they made. Hopefully your brain is firing with all kinds of connections here. Isn't that what Paul is describing in Philippians 2? Jesus saw a mess that we had made that we couldn't fix for ourselves, and so he lowered himself even though he didn't need to, and came down and changed the form into the form that he needed to take in order to help us with that. And we did not accept him, we did not recognize him, we actually made his job harder, and he stayed for our benefit. And then where Paul goes with that later on is, therefore, God has highly exalted him and given him a name above every name. And by the way, that name is Jesus. Okay? Jesus rejected any advantage. And you can keep making the points. He rejected temporary pleasure. What do you think that was in Matthew chapter 4 when he went out into the wilderness and Satan tried to tempt him? See, he is tempting him to give in to all these shortcuts and temporary things. And Jesus just says, no, 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 no. He didn't give in. He quotes Scripture, and when Satan misquotes Scripture, Jesus still doesn't buy that. He doesn't abuse his power in a selfish way. Jesus rejected temporary pleasure. Philippians 2, we've already made the point. He chose humiliation. In Luke chapter 22, verses 39 through 46, when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was afraid, but he did not let fear control him. Listen, I love Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. It is not often that we have the words that Jesus prayed, but they're included there. And he prayed it several times. And I don't want to get into the specifics of what exactly was it that made him so fearful. What was it that made that so intense? I have some theories about that. But whatever it was made the Son of God say, please, 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 no, if there's any other way than this, don't make me do it. But in the end, he submitted and did not let fear control him. He submitted to the Father. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, at the conclusion of the section on faith, and as he leads into talking about being surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, he talks about the endurance of Jesus, who for the glory that was set before him endured the cross. Jesus endured. And when we were in Acts chapter 7, Stephen is making a case. He's building up in this sermon, and he uses Moses in the Exodus. And one of the points that he's making is, your fathers always rejected every deliverer God sent to them. Moses was a test case of that. And oh, by the way, the most recent one was the carpenter's son from Nazareth, who happened to be the Son of God, and you rejected him. And they weren't super excited about that. I mean, Stephen ends up getting martyred over his sermon. But his point is the same. Just like your forefathers rejected Moses, you all, it's so much worse. You rejected the Son of God. The great thing about all of that is that was actually part of God's plan. God knew they would reject him. It was prophesied. That's why Moses was a type. And it was through God's wisdom of the gospel and his Son that he provided salvation through that rejection, through that death, through the resurrection, through the ascension. It's because of what he suffered and who he suffered it for that we have the possibility of forgiveness of sins. And that's preached all through the book of Acts. You rejected him, but there's forgiveness. There's hope. Just stop rejecting him. You have to accept him for who he is and who he claimed to be. So there are all kinds of lessons that we can take between this parallel between Moses and Jesus, and we'll talk about 5 as we make application. Serving the Lord always begins with humility. If you want to serve the Lord and do it to his glory, you had better humble yourself. And I'm going to say something and probably get a little bit emotional, but I said it when I preached this down in Alabama a month ago, right? And I don't know enough people here to step on anybody's toes, so this is free. The Lord's church does not need any more arrogant, self-serving, networking, professional pulpiteers. Do you understand what I'm saying? We do not need anyone else that is excited to get up in a pulpit because they get a business card that says minister or evangelist of XYZ. I don't care who you trained under or what piece of paper you've got. We do not need any more of those kinds of men. The Lord's body needs more men who have been broken by their sin and redeemed by the gospel, and out of their love for Jesus, proclaim that everywhere, whether anyone knows they're saying it or not. We need more men willing to serve in little tiny churches in the middle of nowhere because they're listening. I know some men and some young men that would not preach in certain places because it was beneath them to do it. The Lord does not need any more men like that. That applies to elders. That applies to deacons. We need more men like Moses, and look, it took God 40 years to humble Moses to the point where he could use him again. Let God humble you. And let him use you the way he's going to use you, even if it's not the way that you thought when you were 18. Serving the Lord always begins with humility. Okay, I'll get off that soapbox. Your faith in God must be greater than the fear of man. Moses had moments of fear, but he did not let that fear control him. Instead, his reverence for God drove him. His faith in a great God is what drove him. There are times where you're going to be scared to do what's right, and there's going to be a high cost. That's okay to say it's scary. It's okay to say, I really don't want to do this. That's all right, as long as at the end of it, you get there and you do it. It does not demonstrate a lack of faith on your part to say it's hard. It's honest. Say it's hard. But then, by faith, eventually do it. Mistreatment with God's people is better than the temporary pleasures of sin. That was Moses' conclusion. That was also Christ's conclusion. That ought to be our conclusion. And just like Moses in Hebrews chapter 11, suffering with Jesus is better than earthly treasure. Some of the conversations we had at lunch today among a couple of us kind of highlighted this. It is so relatively easy to be a Christian in the West. It's getting harder, especially here in the States. But there are some places in the world where it will threaten your life if you choose to follow Jesus. We've just been really spoiled that it's as easy as it is. I mean, I had some friends in the last 6 months that traveled to Rwanda to visit Rwandan Christians, and it's difficult for them to meet, even to assemble, and to call themselves a church because there's some restrictions and some oppression, but they do it. They just have to do it kind of quietly and on the sly. We're off of a main street in Ohio. You're blazing the fact we're here, but there's some places where you're not able to do that. But it may get to the point where you don't have that privilege anymore. And will you still follow God and still suffer with Christ when it's not that easy? What Moses ended up doing is focusing on what is eternal and the one who is invisible, is what Hebrews chapter 11 emphasizes. If you want to serve people, if you want to be used by God, you've got to focus on what is eternal, and you need to focus on the one who is invisible. Okay? Don't use earthly metrics to measure your success in your service to God. One of my favorite examples of that is Ezekiel. I love Ezekiel, and Ezekiel terrifies me. God sent Ezekiel to preach to a hard-hearted people for 70 years and told him up front, no one is going to listen to you. Go. And he did it. And if you were to ask him, so how many people did you convert to God's will? Decade 1, decade 2, decade 3. But God wasn't evaluating his success by numbers. He was measuring his success by his faithfulness. Do you keep going, and do you keep preaching, and do you keep saying what I tell you to say? Do you do it when your wife dies? Do you do it when I make a mockery out of you? Do you do it when you have to do embarrassing things, or shave half your beard, or sleep on one side for a long time? And he just faithfully does it. Okay? Don't measure success by visible earthly metrics. You measure it by, am I faithful to the one who is invisible? Because that's all God's going to ask you. When you get to heaven, did you do what I called you to do? I'm not asking about results. Did you do what I called you to do? To a husband and wife who are struggling, well, my marriage didn't turn out exactly right, my spouse didn't respond. I'm not asking about that. But did you love them the way that I called you to love them? Did you submit the way that I called you to submit? Well, my kids didn't turn out quite right. I didn't ask you to crank out perfect kids. I asked you to bring them up. Did you bring them up? Right? Are you faithful to the instructions that the invisible one has given? You all are amazing. You're so patient. And you let me tap dance all over your toes. Thank you. And I'm preaching to myself when I'm preaching this. Right? I need to hear these things. If you need to be more like Moses, if you've been convicted by what we've read in Exodus chapter 2, or you realize you need to be more like Jesus as a disciple of his, by what we've looked at in Acts chapter 7 and Hebrews 11 and all these other New Testament passages, you have an opportunity to share that with the congregation. Maybe there's something fearful that you're facing and it's kind of paralyzing you, and you need greater faith to just do what he calls you to do. We'd like to pray with you and help you make that commitment. However it is that you need to respond to what we've read tonight, let us know by coming to the front as we stand and as we sing.